Las ciudades son en últimas mercados laborales. Hay una alta correlación entre el tamaño del mercado laboral y el crecimiento de las ciudades. Si entendemos eso en el momento de diseñar las ciudades y somos conscientes de la importancia que tiene generar servicios de accesibilidad, de movilidad, entre otros, vamos a hacer que nuestras ciudades sean más productivas y que los mercados laborales sean, por supuesto, más pujantes. Los dejo ahora con el experto Alain Bertaud de la Universidad de Nueva York, quien nos va a contar un poco de qué se trata este enfoque y el impacto que tiene en el desarrollo de nuestras ciudades.
My name is Alain Bertaud. I am an urbanist. I have worked in many cities of the world, in rich cities and in poor cities alike. I enjoy very much working in cities and following them as they develop. I am now working at the Maron Institute as a research scholar, and I teach also a course at NYU on cities and mostly on markets and design of cities. Cities as labor market, mobility and affordability. We're going to look at three main ideas. First, the efficiency of large labor market and why they are the cause of ever-growing cities. Second, what really dictate this productivity of large labor market. They depend on the ability to maintain mobility and also maintain housing affordability. And finally, the third part of the talk will be the operational implication of cities as viewed as labor market. This is not an academic debate. It's really to see how urban planners can look at cities maybe slightly differently in order to make sure that they understand the mechanism of labor market and what are the implications on day-to-day planning. The efficiency of large labor market is a main cause of ever-growing cities. This is something which is sometimes a little difficult to accept for urban planners. They are used to think that cities can be designed and that even in a certain way they have a tendency to think that when there are a large migration toward a city, it creates a lot of problems, and maybe part of their job is to slow down this growth. In fact, when people move to a city, they are looking first of all for jobs, and they eventually will find a job in the city, although it may take some time. So the role of planner is really to face urbanization head on, not to try to slow it down or to make it difficult for new migrants. The cities are primarily labor market. This is a little shocking to a lot of people who like cities because working is certainly very interesting and rewarding, but they see in large cities much more than labor market. They see going with their friend to a cafe, meeting their family, doing some sport, going to concerts and restaurants. All these many other things that we absolutely love about cities are possible only if there is a functioning labor market. Without a functioning labor market, all these other things that we like about cities will disappear. One example, recent example in the US is the city of Detroit. Detroit was a very prosperous city. Detroit had one of the most beautiful museums in the world. It was also a place where new music was invented. And suddenly the labor market collapsed and all these other things which were above the labor market disappeared. So we have to take very seriously labor market and we have to understand how they work. Why large labor markets are more productive than smaller ones? There is a very large economic literature on that. I will not dwell on it too long, but we know about increasing return to scale, agglomeration economy, scale economies, knowledge spillovers. All these are, in fact, it's an economic jargon to say that when people get close together in large concentration, they exchange ideas, they become more productive, and even more important, more creative. And it's this face-to-face contact which allow that. even in our time where we have the feeling sometimes that the internet is a substitute for face-to-face contact, in fact we see now that large company, large high-tech company are encouraging their employees to come to headquarters much more than before. This is why Google, for instance, and Apple have built recently enormous headquarters where they try to create an environment where people not only come to work with, I would say, a lot of pleasure, but also to maximize face-to-face contact with people who are not necessarily in the same division or same department. So again, here, you have on one hand the academic work of economists will prove that large labor markets are more productive than smaller ones, but we have also the day-to-day experience of the most efficient and creative high-tech company who reinforce this idea. How is all of those labor markets to work inside a city? First, we need labor mobility. Labor mobility means two things. First, for workers, the ability to find the right job. And when you start in your career and you move to a big city, you don't necessarily end up with your dream job. You end up with a job which will pay the rent, which is not probably completely uninteresting. But it is by looking around that you will find eventually a job which is slightly better, and little by little you will find, workers will find their own talent, and all of them are quite different. And in a large city, there is a big chance that after a few years, workers will find really the type of work they really enjoy doing. And if they enjoy doing it, they are probably good at it. For the firms, it's exactly the same thing. They are going to hire workers, just based on an interview or a resume. Some of this worker will do very well, others not so well. For them, it's very important to be able to choose among a very large number of workers. For firms also, there is the environment of a firm is changing all the time, and sometimes they have to adjust also all their workforce to the new environment. Therefore, they may have to recruit people who are extremely specialized in a very narrow field, and those people are more likely to be found in a large labor market, in a large city, than in a small one. For instance, let us try to imagine if you are working in a small company town, a small town which has mostly one employer and few services. The possibility here of changing job are very limited. It's possible if the worker doesn't want to change town, that he or she will stay in the same company all the time. It will be probably quite life, but not very good for creativity. If the company goes on hard time, then the worker will be unemployed, and even the people who do not work in the company but work in service will have difficulty finding jobs. So a small town is very, very vulnerable to economic change. Where the larger the city is, the more diverse it is, the less vulnerable it is to change in the world economy. For instance, we could compare if you work in a large city like Bogota or Shanghai or Mumbai, you will have much better chance to even change sector during your career. And for an employer, it's exactly the same thing, the ability to find the right worker. So if such a large city are more efficient than smaller one, and their productivity and salaries are higher, why do firms and households do not all move to large city and just abandon smaller city? Well, in large cities, rents are much higher because there are more people who are looking for apartment. For firms, it's the same thing. The rent for office building or factories are much higher. So there are certain firms who will prefer if they need a lot of land or a lot of floor space, they will prefer to move to smaller towns where rents are lower. Workers may also prefer to have, let's say, a less stressful job, maybe less creative, and that's why they move to a smaller city. I'm not saying here that you don't find creative people in smaller cities, but usually they have, if they are very creative, they will have a better chance to find an employer in a larger firm, in a larger city. So the possibility of intercity mobility, that means the possibility of moving from city to city, is also part of this labor mobility. It's indispensable for the economy. At the same time, it is also, of course, very essential to be able to move within a city. So there is quite a literature actually on this mobility between cities, and some economists recently are a little worried that the mobility in the US in particular has decreased enormously in the last 20 years, and they feel that this decrease is due precisely to the extremely high cost of housing in large cities, which discourage people from going there, even if they if they feel that they will have a much better job there. So that, according to those economists, the cost to the economy, this means the cost to society, is enormous. If I remember well, Enrico Moretti think that it represents about 3 or 4% of GDP. The loss of people who cannot access a large city because of the high cost of housing. So that will be also the second point of my talk, is that you don't need only mobility, you need affordability. Planners, it's a responsibility of planners to be sure that to have a well-functioning labor market, you should have also affordable housing for people who are newcomers to the city and want to join the labor force. So large concentration of people at high density in itself do not constitute large labor market if there is no mobility. For instance, you may have very large city where the transport system is so, the performance of the transport system is so bad that in fact this large city is divided into smaller labor market, and this large city in fact will have the productivity, the sum of the productivity of smaller cities, not the productivity which corresponds to the sum of its labor pool. It shows that really if you have a very large city, you cannot take for granted that the productivity will be very high. The productivity will be high only if workers within this city can access a maximum of job, ideally 100% of job in less than 1 hour. So they should be able to commute from any part of the city to another and have access to 100% of the job. Obviously, workers are not interested in 100% of the jobs, and firms are not interested in 100% of the candidates which are in a city. But it's a good rule of thumb to think that what mobility is all about. Mobility is not to be able to get to your work in, say, 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Mobility is the ability to select a new job among the ones which are offered within a metropolitan area. And that is possible with only two conditions. First, you should have a transport system which allow you to go anywhere in the city in less than 1 hour. And second, there should be many areas in the city which are affordable to your level of income, so that you can select the best area which suit your needs. So the increase in efficiency due to the size of labor market is only potential. It's mobility which makes it real. And arbitrarily, I've selected 60 minutes travel time as the maximum that people should commute one way. Some economists argue that commuting more than 40 minutes, for instance, start reducing productivity. Other will put it at slightly more, like 100 minutes or something like that already. I think that 60 minutes is a good, from a human point of view, is a good limit, but it should be an upper limit. On this slide, I have represented the trip pattern and the spatial distribution of jobs, depending on the spatial arrangement of jobs and residents. On the left, the first graph is showing the typical monocentric city where most of the jobs are concentrated in the center and people commute from the periphery to the center. This is a rather simple pattern. It can be served very well by public transport because although the origin of trips are dispersed, their destinations are highly concentrated. We find this type of pattern really in relatively small cities. Originally, all large cities started like that, but when cities are more than 1 million, usually this pattern change a bit, as we will see on the few next graph. The second type of pattern is a dispersed, when you have a dispersed job distribution and dispersed origin, also dispersed residential area. This is what you have, for instance, this is a pattern in Los Angeles or Atlanta, where jobs are really dispersed around the metropolitan area with not much concentration. There is a center, but there is not much concentration of job in the center. So the trips are very different from the monocentric city. The trips are in fact nearly randomly distributed, and they are dispersed origin and dispersed destination. This is why in cities like Los Angeles or Atlanta, it's extremely difficult to establish a transit system, buses or subways, because the trips are really so much dispersed that it's nearly impossible to have a network which will, cover enough trip. The third graph shows what I call the composite model, which is in fact a superimposition of the two first graphs. One is monocentric, so you still have a center which is relatively strong, but you have also a lot of trips which are from suburbs to suburbs. This represents the pattern of many cities in the world now, whether it's New York, Paris, Shanghai, or Mumbai. There is still a strong historical center. For instance, in New York, you have Manhattan, and Midtown and downtown continue to be a very strong attractor and strong concentration of job. But many of the trips are in fact from suburbs to suburbs. In New York, as well as in Paris, 70% of the trip in the metropolitan area are not to the center, they are from suburbs to suburbs. We sometimes tend to forget that because most of us either work or visit the center of cities, and we have the feeling that the center of cities is where everything happens. It's not quite true. The real economy of New York is not necessarily downtown or midtown. Most of the jobs are distributed in a very wide area in the suburbs. The fourth graph do not represent anything which exists in reality. I call it the urban village myth. I still represent it because I find this graph in a lot of master plan around the world. Planners tend to think that if they could manage through a very clever land use regulation to match jobs and housing in the same area, then you will solve completely the problem of transport in a large city. Everybody will live close to his or her job. You could walk to your job or at most bicycle, and you will avoid all the peak hour rush and congestion. This sounds very good because indeed it will have a lot of advantages. It will save on energy, it will save on time. Imagine people in a very large city commuting 10 minutes, they will have a lot of time for doing all sorts of things. The problem with this very attractive model is that it doesn't exist. It has never existed, and it cannot exist because it completely contradicts the idea of a free labor market. It means that you are obliged to work within, let's say, 1 kilometer from your house. If you want to change job and work somewhere else where they offer you a better job, you'll have to change house. As most of us live with partners, some people live alone, but not all. That means that also, if your partner gets a job somewhere else, either you'll have to leave your partner, or one of you will have to abandon the idea of living in a village. So this this theory of the urban village where everybody lives close to his work do not exist. It's important to insist on that because if it could exist, then the transport system of very large city will be relatively simple. Bicycle and walking will cover all of it. If you believe in that, then planners will not invest enough in transport. And transport which could bring, like subways or heavy rail or buses or cars or highway, whatever is required to transport people within a city. So this mythical arrangement has created, in fact, a lot of damage to cities by reducing the amount of investment in transport and in particular transit. Here is a representation of Paris metropolitan area. You see the red circle in the middle, the smaller circle in the middle. This is Paris municipality. This is historical Paris that most people visit. And it has about 2.5 million people. But the area represented here, which is metropolitan Paris, is in fact now about 12 million people. And most of the trips, 70% of the trip, are in fact from suburbs to suburb. So whatever economies support historical Paris, the historical Paris we know, is in fact coming from the work of people living in the suburbs. And the transport of those people from where they live to where they work is a very important problem. Many of them now, because a lot of planners have not realized this, are spending more than an hour to commute again from suburb to suburb. One problem for the further extension of labor market in ever larger cities is that it seems that our transport system seems to have reached a limit in terms of speed. Some planners think that if you increase the density of cities, some planners call it compact cities, you will reduce commuting distance, and therefore you could accommodate more workers, more people, and still keeping within less than an hour commuting time. This is not quite true. If we compare cities that have very low density, like for instance Dallas-Fort Worth, with cities which have very high density, like Hong Kong, Hong Kong has a density which is 2 orders of magnitude larger than Dallas. For instance, Hong Kong is around 350 people per hectare, where Dallas-Fort Worth is around 8 people per hectare. Now, and their population is about the same. If we look at the transport time in Hong Kong for people who are taking transit, and 80% of people in Hong Kong are taking transit because specifically with this very high density, the use of car is nearly not possible. So only about 20% of people are using private car. So the people who are using transit are now very close to, they are around 50 minutes commuting time, very close to my limit of 1 hour. And this is average, of course. That means that some people are commuting, half people are commuting much more. The Hong Kong subway is one of the best organized in the world. So we seem to have reached here a limit. we have probably, if we want to keep increasing the productivity due to large labor market, we will have to invent new means of transport across cities. On this slide, I'm showing horizontally the speed of a different mode of transit, in red BRT and in blue subways, and vertically I'm showing the capacity in passenger per direction per hour, which is also a very important indicator in a transit system. You see that the best performing BRT, the dots in red, is in fact represented by the Bogota Transmilenio, but it's bumping around 28 kilometers an hour. It cannot go faster. Don't forget that this is not the speed of travel from home to office. This is only the speed of travel from station to station. So probably the speed of travel door to door will be about double, there will be half of that. When we look at subways, which are going faster and with a higher capacity, the most modern subway that I have found, the faster one, was in Seoul, Line 9 in Seoul, which is an express subway line, which means that it doesn't stop at every station. And here we reach 55 kilometers an hour. Again, here, if you consider now that many metropolitan areas are more than 100 kilometers across, this is not a speed which is enough to maintain an integrated labor market. So we will have to find new combination of transport. Again, I want to insist on the two definitions of mobility. One, the first definition is to move rapidly between origin and destination of commuting trip in less than 1 hour. And the second definition of mobility is the ability to change the origin and the destination of trip as circumstances dictate. That means that workers should be also able to change their house or their location of residence depending on their circumstances and what is more convenient for them. So those two forms of mobility are very important if we want to increase productivity. Now, what are the operational implications of cities if we look at them as labor market? First, we have to abandon the idea that by reducing the supply of land, therefore forcing city in a more compact form, we have to abandon the idea that this will create a faster commute. It may not. It probably will not. On the other hand, within a city, there are a lot of activities which require land. Some not much, like office building, for instance, but others require some land. And so in a city, it is absolutely necessary to have area with a high density, but area with low density, where land is cheaper, and where some firms can find enough land for their activities. So the idea that planners should have compact city, where they push for density, whatever this density is, in order to save on distance, is not really a real choice. I will quote, one, I think, a very prominent transport planner, Bob Poole, which says, longer but faster commute lead to a more robust urban economy. I believe in that too. One of the ways to solve this problem for most cities of both affordability and mobility will be to expand the right-of-way of major road far into the future and to expand them far before urbanization is taking place. That will reserve those right-of-way and will ensure, in fact, two things. First, mobility, because you could have a network, a grid of major roads in advance of urbanization, and this will allow, in particular, especially if you use a grid as a system, it will allow easy commuting from suburb to suburb. We have seen that this commuting from suburb to suburb is going to become more and more important in the future. Second, those roads, those future roads traced in advance, will allow a large supply of land to be ready to be developed, and therefore reduce the price of land for practically everybody in the city. It will allow developers to create new housing, and there will be enough land so that high-income people and low-income people will not have to compete for the same area of land when the land is scarce, as we have seen in the past. One example of that in the 30s in New York was the creation of Levittown. It was a way for lower middle income people to have access to affordable housing, and it was possible because the car made, in fact, a large amount of land available for the development of city. So one of the conclusion of my talk now is that if we really consider that the productivity and the creativity of city is very important, the major role of planner is to ensure mobility by creating a grid of roads which will, as the city expands, will allow this easy commuting again from suburb to suburb or from suburb to center, and at the same time will not restrict the supply of land, so land will become completely unaffordable to newcomers, as it is the case right now, I believe, in New York and San Francisco, for instance, but also in Mumbai and Shanghai.